in a Western country, there are so many people continuously asking questions like, will India the next China, not China, but it's industrialized or developed like China, and or which country will be the next China? What's your take on these questions?
This is probably a more misleading way to think about the future. There would be no next China in the sense there was China, because history never repeats itself. Just take, for instance, the Chinese Revolution. The conditions under which communist parties emerged as the leadership of the nation, whether it was the context of imperialism, whether it was the context of struggle for land rights, these contexts have disappeared. We can't bring them back. They might come back to us in different forms, but countries have to create these moments. So we don't live in the situation where even to think about socialism or a socialist revolution, every country can imagine a communist party emerging out of a warlike situation because they were at the forefront of leading the anti-imperial struggle, and the struggle for land rights got entangled with that. No one is reproducing these situations. Or think about the post-reform success of China. When Chinese industrial labor was competing, it was competing against very, or let's say, relatively more expensive labor in the United States, in Germany, and in elsewhere, which was not as expensive as those in the West, but relatively still more expensive than Chinese labor. And so there was a different situation. Now, if India wants to industrialize, it still has China. And China, the remarkable fact about Chinese industrialization is because of the big size of China and the unevenness that it has. China has never moved up the value chain in the traditional way that other countries do, because when you are smaller countries, you move up the value chain, you start to offshore those at the lower end of the value chain. But China still has a hinterland where the per capita income difference is 2 to 3 times. So a lot of assembly lines and production lines are shifting away from the coastal regions because wages have gone up here to the hinterland. And we see a lot of factories and, industrial hubs and others coming up in Western China. I don't see anytime soon those things are moving away from China. So the remarkable fact is China is producing airplanes, fighter jets, AI, biotechnology, but China is also continuing to produce toys and leather goods and textiles, and China is not evacuating them anytime soon. And so if African nations or South Asian nations are rethinking about their industrial policies, they can think about relying on export-led growth the way China did. And secondly, also, we are not living in a globalized world where trade and investment, global investments, are encouraged the way it was done in the 90s and the early 2000s. President Trump is running roughshots over trade, but that is also having an enormous impact on investment flows. As uncertainty rises, we know that capital moves out of the emerging economies into the safe havens in the global north. And so the way China got FDI, the way China was able to export, other countries won't be able to do that in the next decade or so. And finally, the West is very, very stagnant now. When China rose in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, the Western economies were not in their ventilators. Now Europe has stopped growing. And I don't see Europe resolving out of that. So there is a slump in the global demand, and significantly exacerbated since the global financial crisis. Even growth in the United States is far lower post-global financial crisis than what it used to be. Of course, China has added demand to it, but the interesting thing is that a lot of Chinese demand being added serves Chinese supply lines. And now that China faces a lot of backlash from both Europe and the West, China would be shifting some of its export-led growth to its domestic consumption, because as you would know that China has a much lower share of domestic consumption if you consider the overall pool of investment. And so there is a greater space, and there are increasingly talks about raising the domestic demand, and there are very many mechanisms to do that. So a lot of demand that is being added by China would be consumed by Chinese industries themselves. And so what I would say is that it is futile to think about India as being the next China, because you cannot trace these paths. But if one is naive and think about the phrase next China, not in terms of tracing the exact path, but reaching a position where you become globally important, that is something where I'm not very optimistic about India, not because I think that the aggregate power of India won't rise. It will definitely rise. India is still growing at 7%, and it would continue to grow for a while. India also has a large population. So in the aggregate, India would still increase its influence and power. Nevertheless, the reality of India is such that India stands at 111 out of some 121 or 130 countries that participate in Global Hunger Index. So India still hosts the largest number of malnourished people, hungry people, stunted people, wasted people. India's literacy is somewhere around late 70s for male, late 60s for female. Indian cities desperately lack basic infrastructure. And when you have such a mess at your backyard, even if you clock real growth, even if you increase your aggregate power, I don't think India would look like China, because the moment you step into Indian cities, you see a whole lot of people that live on begging. You see a lot of broken infrastructure. You see waste disposal system that doesn't function at all. You see broken public transport, right? So I think India should be able to fix them. If India can fix these things and India can continue to grow, then I think India will definitely be one of the key players aside from China and the United States in the next 50 years or so.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。